Hello and welcome back to New Wave, your go-to resource about climate investing in Europe. This is a very short and unusual 20-minute podcast. It doesn't follow the traditional format that we have, but look, Altrove just raised a 10 million seed round. It is such an amazing company and I really wanted to talk to the founders to understand what they are doing and how they are doing it. Before we start, don't forget to take 2 seconds to follow us on Spotify and Apple Podcast or to subscribe and leave a comment on YouTube. All right, music and let's go. Thibaud, thank you so much for taking the time to chat. I know it's a very, very busy week for you and your co-founder, so happy to be able to take some time from you. For people that haven't heard the news yet, what did you announce this week?
We announced that Altrove raised $10 million to accelerate the discovery of new materials to replace vulnerable ones that contain rare earths.
Interesting. Well, look, let's dive a little bit deeper into the product. So what's your approach to material discovery? What are you selling?
So just for context, for maybe listeners that are not aware, so our whole industry, whether it's new technology, whether it's green energy or even just clean energy nowadays, requires insane amounts of insecure, vulnerable materials that we basically import for 100%. Like we don't produce any of them in the West, and we need more of them in the next 20 years than we have in all of history. And where do we import them from? For the most part, from China, which holds, in the case of rare earths, for instance, over 90% of the supply chain, whether it's for mining or refining. So until that point, and because we have all that need, most initiatives, whether it's from regulators, investors, has been focused on either mining, so mining more, mining locally, but it comes with a bunch of problems and challenges, especially if you want to open a mine in Europe nowadays, it's really complicated, or from recycling, right? And recycling is great, it's a great idea, but at the end of the day, it's just like maybe 1% of the demand can be done that way. And so we need a third path, and that third path is substitution, and that's what we do at Altrove. We develop new materials that behave like the ones we want to replace, but without the problems that are inherent with them. The problem is that substitution up until like now was basically science fiction. It wasn't possible to create brand new materials, disruptive materials out of the blue. It was super long. Materials R&D was super long, super expensive. And so the promise that we have at Altrove, and I mean, I can discuss further about why this is possible now, but the promise we have is to bring down the time and the costs of developing these new materials from over a decade and over $100 million down to months and less than 500K.
Well, let's jump into why it is possible now. What makes it possible today that wasn't possible 2 years or 5 years ago?
Historically, material science has been held back by a very big bottleneck, which is we didn't know what materials could exist, like what could exist, the realm of possibility. And if you don't know what the realm of possibilities are, you're basically doing fundamental research. And so historically, and materials companies for the record are like usually really old, like 100, 200-year-old companies like DuPont, BASF, Saint-Gobain. They're really old companies. And traditionally they spent, well, not that much percentage of their revenues in R&D, doing mostly, I would say, iterative improvements on materials that they already know, right? So basically just developing and improving on known materials, 1% here, 1% there. And it was very rare to have like completely breakthrough new materials that came out and really changed the game in the whole industry. And when it did happen, because it has happened in the past, it was mostly serendipitous. It was like, oh, I discovered Kevlar or I discovered Teflon. And it was usually like, I don't know, academic researchers stumbling upon something almost out of strike of luck, sometimes looking for something completely different, and then realizing that the application could be huge in some other field. But obviously, like it's really hard to build a business around like, oh yeah, I'm going to get lucky super often, right?
Yeah, tell that to your investors. Like, I'm going to get lucky.
Yeah, don't worry. Give me a ton of money and eventually I'll get lucky many, many times in a row. And so, well, what's interesting is that, so again, just simplifying a bit, but what's a material, right? If you look at the periodic table, there's like 130 elements in it. And if we say that a material is basically a combination of different elements, we've tried combinations of two elements for a while. Like there's like 5,000 of them, and it's been tried for a super long time. But as soon as you start adding new elements, it's a factorial, and it becomes super computationally complicated to predict like what are all the combinations that could exist, because you easily get into the hundreds of millions or the billions. So it was a compute problem. And so what's interesting is that a couple of years ago, like literally 2023, companies that are not chemical companies, like Alphabet, so DeepMind, Meta, Microsoft, and a bunch of academic labs have been releasing models that are excellent at trying all these combinatory approaches in a much more compute efficient way, and therefore trying many combinations and discovering a bunch that are on paper stable. So basically they're like, okay, if I put an atom of copper and two atoms of carbon and one atom of oxygen that way, just for the sake of the example, and if I shape, if they're assembled that way, that material should be stable or metastable. And what was interesting for us, and the reason we decided to get started with Altrove, is because we thought, okay, these companies that are not chemical companies we believe are on the verge of solving, or will eventually, because this is the beginning of a wave, make answering the question, what could exist, a commodity. Like possibilities will be pretty much endless. There's already like hundreds of thousands of predictions that exist, which is more than had ever been predicted before. And there's thousands more coming in every other month, every other week. And so we built Altrove because we thought, okay, the bottleneck is now going to move from what could exist to how do you make it. And so that's what we do. Our job is to figure out among all these possibilities, which ones are relevant for the use cases we want to tackle. And then how do we find the recipe for how to turn that prediction into an industrial reality?
And if we think about the technologies that you're building today and the innovation that you bring to the process, you're not building the model. You're more on the side of saying, let's apply the model and let's actually build the material and sell the material. You're not like a copilot for material discovery. You're actually producing an output.
Correct. So we're not, so that these models that DeepMind and Microsoft and others have been doing, like we're not doing this. So they're let's call them foundational models, for lack of a better word. So they're foundational models. Our job is, we're agnostic. We're looking through all of these predictions, and we're building our own models that have a different purpose. Our models are more chemistry oriented, and their job is to say, okay, if I take this prediction in this crystalline structure and I input this into my model, can I generate recipes that are likely to synthesize this? Like it's never been made before in the history of the planet. And you're like, okay, how would you make this, right? And you train models on known recipes and on experimental data that we produce. And that model basically turns out, AI designs recipes, sends you like hundreds of possibilities. You rank them by the most likely to the least likely to succeed. And then what we built is, we also have a lab. So we have this AI and lab interfacing. And we have a lab it's called a high throughput lab. So it's a robotized lab that does hundreds of experiments every week. And where basically you A/B test in real life what the recipes. So you do like dozens of batches of 10 samples every week. And you're like, okay, I'm going to follow the recipes. I'm going to make this. And then you're like, okay, what did I just make? And usually you didn't make what you wanted to make. So what's important is, and that's okay, what's important is, what's the delta and how far off am I? And then analyze that feedback, send it automatically back to your models. And you say, guys, like the delta is that big because of this, and that. And then your model modify the recipes, re-rank them, and you start a new iteration cycle that brings you one step closer to the real thing. And at the end of the day, the output is an actual physical material.
Interesting. And if we think actually about the state of your company right now, and have you already been able to produce new materials? Where do you stand in terms of progress?
Yeah, so we've made new materials that have never been synthesized before. We've optimized. So optimization is called in our focus. So just for the record, we do inorganic materials. So we focus on like powders, crystals, and stuff like this. So we don't do like plastic. We do really metals. Like then again, like magnets without rare earths, or like piezoelectric sensors and stuff like this. And so we've discovered completely brand new ones that didn't exist before, had never been made before. We've also optimized known ones beyond their current capacity. So it's called doping, right? So it's like making the most out of their potential, let's say. And we've done this we had actually a benchmark. So we knew there was a material that a customer of ours took 10 years to develop, and they wanted to try our technology and see if we were real, right? So they said, okay, it took us 10 years to develop this magnet at this industrial grade. We're not going to tell you how we did it, and let's see how fast you can match these. So match the requirements, right? And we matched and exceeded these in 12 weeks. So we were 97% faster. And they did this just a few years ago. It's just how fast the technology is advancing and how good we can get nowadays.
Thibaud, that sounds like science fiction to me. It's crazy that, first of all, you've been able to do that in 12 weeks, but also just to invent new materials. I always kind of thought that nothing else could be invented on this planet, but you're proving me wrong, which is amazing. If we think about the go-to-markets, obviously you mentioned already the rare earths. So I'm thinking batteries, semiconductors, chips for data centers. Like, what exactly are you targeting first? And who are already the first people that are coming along with you and trying to test your model?
Yeah, so that's a really good question. A lot of people are drawing parallels between materials discovery and drug discovery because drug discovery has been doing this kind of stuff for a few years now, and they've really been spearheading the way and showing the way for like what works and what doesn't, including with AI and lab interfacing. But there are also some very big differences. But so just to get on that parallel for a second, materials is a very wide world, right? So it's working on, for instance, polymers is very different than working on crystalline inorganic materials. Or it's the same as like saying I'm doing cancer research or I'm doing research on asthma, for instance. So not all models will work across the board of all different materials. So especially if you have a lab, at some point you have to somehow pick a lane. If you don't have unlimited capital, obviously, you have to pick a lane. So in our case, our lane is, okay, we're going to work on powder metallurgy, metallic powders. So our big use cases are around magnets, so permanent magnets, which are used everywhere in literally like energy harvest, energy production, electric car batteries. That, the microphone I'm using right now has a magnet in it. Your phone has a magnet in it. Like, it's everywhere, right? Then you've got piezoelectric materials. So they're used in sensors, actuators. So they're basically crystals that vibrate when you send them electricity. Or if you make them vibrate, they will produce electricity. So they're used in like defense, aerospace, MRI machines, this kind of stuff. So these are the industries we're working with. So automotive, defense, aerospace, robotics, electronics, generally speaking.
Yeah, which from an investment point of view, obviously, these are like the fast-growing industry right now, with a lot of disruption happening, specifically around like geopolitical topics and everything. But thinking about I have a hard time thinking about your revenue model because you said it earlier. R&D processes takes about 10 years, $100 million to find a new material, usually with a small step improvement. And you're telling me we're doing something completely new, so complete disruption, and it takes us, 12 weeks for that case specifically, but it will take you like a very short period of time. How are you selling the product today?
So it's a choice, right? And I'm not saying like it's a decision that we made. So first of all, when you're creating new materials, you basically, or any business, I guess, you have one of two paths, right? You can go into a blue ocean and say, I'm going to create brand new materials for an industry that I believe will be huge, but doesn't exist yet. So if you want to do room temperature superconductors, or if you want to do carbon capture, it could be huge, but it doesn't really exist. And so some companies in that space are saying, that's what I'm doing. I'm going to focus all of my efforts into developing these new materials. But then, of course, if it works, it's huge, but you have to create supply chains, you have to create demand, you have to price the thing. For us, we picked a slightly different route, which is substitution. So we're tackling industries that already exist with existing supply chains. People already have like a price anchoring and budgets in mind for this kind of stuff that are somewhat flexible depending on what you offer. And so you're coming in saying, hey guys, you're using this material nowadays. You absolutely need them because of their properties, but you wish you didn't because they're a pain in the ass. Because for supply reasons, for regulatory reasons, for sustainability reasons, you can't use them. You want to use alternatives and they don't exist. We're gonna actually make these for you. So how do you sell this? You can either, the technology we're building, you can either sort of sell this as a service, so be like an external R&D or a SaaS, I guess. But we couldn't really make the math work on our end for the kind of impact we wanted to have. And we're talking like materials are $1 trillion industries at the basis of everything that we have technologically as a society. That everything comes down to properties of materials. It's a massive, massive industry. And if you believe you can make a dent in the way that materials are produced and are used, this is a massive opportunity. And the question we're asking ourselves, and we asked, our investors are asking also when you're raising, is how do you capture a substantial part of that pie? And I don't think that's by selling software. I don't think that's by being external CRO. And also, just one thing for the listeners out there that are maybe in the space, one thing that sometimes startups tend to, because like half of our folks in-house are like AI scientists and whatnot. But when we're selling to companies, which are industrial companies, they don't really care that we're doing AI. They don't really care that we're doing robotized labs. They care about really tangible, like, can you put something on my desk that then I can prototype with, that then I can put into my motors, and that then has performance? So we're not talking the same language. They're talking industry, reliance, supply chain, and you're talking AI, LLMs, machine learning, self-improvements, active learning. So you need to be bilingual, right, in both of these languages. And the thing is, it makes you very humble when you realize that the industrial world, if you tell them, hey guys, I made this great computational model and it's able to spin out recipes, to spur out recipes that are amazing on paper. If you haven't been able to test them and prove that they work in real life, and if you haven't been able to prove that they work not only for 1 gram, but for 100 kilos, 100 tons, 1,000 tons, because this is what makes a difference, right? This is what your customers need. Then nobody cares. Like, yeah, you're doing great science. That's really fun. Congrats on your Nobel Prize or whatever. Like, how do you actually change things, and how do you actually impact people and industries? That's by making stuff in the 1,000 tons plus scale. And it's really hard, and it's kind of cocky to assume that just because you've made this great software and it's able to come up with these great recipes, that this is what has value in any material. Like, what has value is also, in a large part, what happens afterwards, and how do you bridge that first prediction to an industrial reality.
I mean, I can see the level of ambition that you have as well. But look, to close this podcast, I have 2 more topics that I want to talk about. The first one is, obviously, we've seen this industry is booming. We've seen Cusp AI and a few others getting 100 million plus rounds. How are you differentiating from them?
So again, it's a massive opportunity, and so people are going at this with like high ambitions. I think so. A lot of players are focused mostly on the computational part, right? So the what could exist part, but there's no experimental validation, or ever so slowly. So of course it comes with huge costs, because if you want to create basically let's say, to simplify, like an LLM, like a science AGI agent, which some of these guys are trying to do, and which is great, and really, like, I'd love this if this worked. But obviously that requires insane compute, and it's kind of a bet, right? It's like, we think this could be huge, and so we're going to go all in and train like for hundreds of millions worth of compute these models, and we believe eventually they'll be amazing. For us, we're trying to be laser focused on just the synthesis part, which is, we believe, the bottleneck, and we believe where the value accrues. And so we have that dual approach between AI and experimental. And so I think we're more focused than a lot of these players. And also, we're not, because we don't need to train these insane foundational models, and we're basically relying on, we're basically agnostic on that front. Of course, our compute budgets are a lot, smaller, and needs are a lot smaller than theirs.
But you also need to have the lab budget, which is also likely expensive. But look, let's talk about the round to close this podcast. You've raised 10 million in a seed. The climate today for fundraising is quite difficult, specifically when we think about climate tech companies. I'm curious, what unlocked the seed round, would you say? What is the thing that convinced your investors?
We'd made a lot of progress since the pre-seed, which was a little bit less than a year before. We hired a sterile team guy. So I think, we're based in France, but even though we're a French and European company, people come from all over the place. We got folks from MIT, from Cambridge, from ETH. So at the end of the day, I think having a stellar team working on something that's really important that actually matters from an industrial perspective, from a technical perspective, and from a geopolitical sovereignty angle. I think this ticks a lot of boxes. We had made insanely fast progress, including with the lab. So actually building the lab and showing that we had delivered on the promises that we made at pre-seed was obviously something big. And I know we are here on a podcast that talks a lot about climate. And I think, so for us, climate is one of the angles. Sustainability is obviously one of the things that we can work on in new materials, because a lot of this stuff we're replacing are catastrophic from a sustainability perspective. But that's not necessarily how we frame it when we fundraise. We're not saying we're a climate company. We're saying we're a company that's working on creating better materials. And if better means for our customers more performance, so be it. If it means being regulatory compliant or improving supply chains, and in the process that makes the replacement a lot more climate friendly, environmental friendly, that's great. And that's how we framed it. We framed it about how can we bring value. As a side effect, it has a massive impact on climate.
Yeah, and I think that gives me hope in the climate transition, because, as you said, there are so many components that are coming into place right now with like problem with supply chains and the geopolitical environment as well, that I think this is the thing that's going to move the needle, ironically.
Yeah, it's very intertwined.
Well, look, one last question for you. What's Altrove's like in 10 years? Like, what's the big vision?
In 10 years, we want to hold hundreds of assets, so basically hundreds of materials that really feel a problem in the market, a gap in the market, where nowadays we're basically trying to fit, a square in a circle, and we're trying to make materials that are more roundish to fit in there and really fit these niches, because there are a lot of really big opportunities that are really badly tackled, and a lot of companies that have to make do with subpar materials. So that's really what we're going after, trying to bring this development time and cost down, and not even going all the way to 10 years, but in 2 years' time, what we want is to be able to sort of start. For us, our Series A will be around starting to distribute at industrial scale our first asset that has been validated at the gram scale, at the kilogram scale, at the ton scale, and ready to start shipping these containers. So that's what's in the books for us.
Well, I love the speed and velocity. But congratulations on the round. Super proud of Altrove. That is also a French company. I must say that's dear to my heart. Thank you for joining me today on the podcast, and we wish you all the best of luck.
Thanks, Hugo.